Jiho, I love her and you know it. We don't have to fight over this.
I don't care. I want her for myself, Ye-Jin.
The first time Ye-Jin Kong walked into the rooftop bar of the Langham Hotel in Chicago, he wasn't looking for love. He wasn't looking for anything really except perhaps a glass of aged scotch and 30 minutes of silence. A commodity that had become increasingly rare since he'd taken over the Kong Empire at 26 years old. At 32, he was the most feared man in Seoul's underworld and the most admired in its boardrooms. Two faces. One man. And tonight, both faces were tired. He loosened the top button of his black brioni shirt, waved off the bodyguard who tried to follow him to the bar, and settled onto a stool at the far end of the counter, away from the laughter and the clinking glasses and the dizzy perfume of rich tourists. He ordered his scotch. The bartender placed it down with practiced elegance. And that was when he heard it, a laugh that cut through the entire ambience of that rooftop like a warm blade through silk. He didn't turn immediately. Ye-Jin Kong was not a man who turned toward things easily. But the laugh came again, full-bodied, uninhibited, real, and something in his chest responded before his brain gave it permission. He turned. She was sitting 3 stools down, arguing passionately with another woman about something on her phone. She was dressed in a deep burgundy wrap dress that kissed her dark skin like it had been custom sewn for exactly that purpose. Her locks were piled high on her head, a few escaping to frame her face, and she wore gold earrings shaped like crescent moons that caught the city lights every time she moved. She was, without question, the most beautiful thing on that rooftop. She was possibly the most beautiful thing Ye-Jin had ever seen, and he had been to Paris, Monaco, and Bali in the same calendar year. "I'm telling you, Tasha," she was saying, her voice husky and authoritative and musical all at once, "the merger clause is garbage. My lawyers found 3 loopholes before breakfast. My father built that company from nothing and I will burn every loophole to the ground before I let those vultures swallow it whole." Her friend said something he couldn't catch. "No, I'm not being dramatic," the beautiful woman said, laughing again. "I'm being accurate. There's a difference." Ye-Jin almost smiled. "There's a difference. You like that?" He didn't approach her that night. That was not his style. He watched her from a careful distance, the way a man watches something rare, not with greed, but with a kind of reverence mixed with the quiet panic of knowing that rare things disappear. When she finally stood to leave, she glanced his way, and their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. Hers were dark brown, intelligent, and completely unimpressed. She looked at him the way she might look at expensive furniture, acknowledging its quality without needing to possess it. He found that extraordinary. He asked the bartender about her after she left. "That's Karen Whitfield," the bartender said with a knowing smile, clearly used to men asking about her. "Her father was Robert Whitfield. Whitfield Industries. She runs it now. She's in here most Thursday nights." Ye-Jin filed that information away like a classified document. Then he finished his scotch, returned to his suite, and lay awake for a long time thinking about crescent moon earrings and the phrase "I'm being accurate, there's a difference." 300 miles away in Manhattan, in the penthouse suite of the Four Seasons on 57th Street, Kang Jiho was having a significantly less contemplative evening. He was, at that exact moment, juggling 2 conversations. One with a Brazilian model named Valentina who was sitting on the arm of a cream velvet sofa, and another with his business associate on the phone, discussing a real estate acquisition in Dubai. Jiho was 28 years old, 4 years younger than his brother, and where Ye-Jin had been forged in silence and gravity, Jiho had been polished in charm and spectacle. He was beautiful in the way that expensive cars are beautiful. Built for admiration, designed for speed, and fundamentally impractical for a quiet life. He ended both conversations within minutes, because something on his laptop screen had caught his eye. A news article. Black heiress Karen Whitfield rebuffs $2.1 billion takeover bid, says Whitfield Industries is not for sale at any price. He clicked on it idly, already half bored. But then the accompanying photograph loaded and Jiho sat up straighter. The woman in the photo was standing outside a courthouse in Chicago, sunglasses on, one hand raised toward the cameras like she was directing traffic rather than dodging reporters. She wore a white blazer, tailored to within an inch of its life, and her expression was one of supreme, gorgeous confidence. Jiho said to no one. He spent the next 45 minutes reading everything publicly available about Karen Whitfield. He found her Instagram, which she hadn't posted on in 2 months. He found an interview she'd given to Forbes in which she said, memorably, "My father taught me that power is not something you inherit, it's something you protect." He found a photo of her at a charity gala in a gold gown that made him exhale slowly through his nose. He texted his assistant. Clear my Chicago schedule for next week. Actually, create a Chicago schedule for next week. Find reasons. His assistant, a hyper-competent woman named So-yeon who had long since stopped being surprised by anything Jiho did, replied within minutes. Done. I've scheduled a site visit for the River North property. Will that work? Perfect, Jiho replied. He didn't think once about his brother, who was already in Chicago. He never did. The second Thursday, Ye-Jin was back at the Langham's rooftop bar. This time he arrived earlier. He had spent the intervening week conducting his legitimate business, a significant investment in a Chicago-based tech firm, but his mind had kept wandering back to that laugh, to those 2 seconds of eye contact, to the fierce intelligence in a woman's voice as she talked about loopholes before breakfast. He was there for 20 minutes before she arrived, this time alone. She wore forest green, and the crescent moons were replaced by small gold hoops. She sat at the bar, ordered a martini she immediately pushed aside in favor of sparkling water when it arrived, and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. Ye-Jin watched her write in it for 5 minutes. Then, because he was Ye-Jin Kong and he had not built an empire by waiting for permission, he picked up his glass and moved 2 stools down. You ordered a martini and chose sparkling water, he said. That's either remarkable self-discipline or a complicated relationship with alcohol. She looked up slowly without alarm and studied him with those unimpressed dark eyes. Or I ordered the martini to keep the bartender from hovering and the sparkling water because I'm working. On a Thursday night. On a rooftop. The best thinking happens away from desks, she said. Then, instead of dismissing him, she tilted her head slightly. You were here last week. He hadn't been sure she'd noticed. I was. You watched me for 2 hours and didn't speak. I didn't want to interrupt your work. Something shifted in her expression. Not softened, Karen Whitfield didn't soften for strangers, but adjusted, recalibrated, like a woman updating her assessment. Karen, she said, extending her hand. Ye-Jin, he replied, taking it. Her grip was firm. Of course it was. That's Korean, she said. I am Korean. What brings a Korean man to a Chicago rooftop bar alone on consecutive Thursdays? A tech investment, he said. Then after a beat, and now you. She looked at him for a long moment, clearly deciding how to file that statement. Then she laughed, that same full real laugh from last week, and said, that was smooth. I'll give you that. She picked up her sparkling water. But I don't date men who lead with smooth. What do you date men who lead with? Honesty, she said. And follow through. Ye-Jin nodded slowly. Then honestly, I have thought about you every day this week. Your voice specifically. The way you said I'm being accurate, there's a difference. It stayed with me. She stared at him. You heard that? Every word. She was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet he watched something in her eyes move, a small tectonic shift, nearly imperceptible. Ye-Jin, she repeated. That means something, doesn't it? In Korean. Art, he said. The name means art. She picked up her notebook and he thought she was about to dismiss him, but instead she turned it toward him. On the page was a loose sketch. Architectural, rough, something that looked like a building elevation. What do you think of this? He looked at it carefully. The northeastern facade is overworked. The rest breathes. She looked at the notebook, then back at him. You know architecture? My mother was an architect. She taught me to see buildings before I could read. Karen Whitfield closed her notebook and turned on her stool to face him fully for the first time. Okay, Ye-Jin, she said. Tell me about your mother's buildings. They talked until the rooftop closed. Jiho arrived in Chicago on a Tuesday. By Wednesday evening he had located Karen Whitfield's preferred gym, a sleek, members-only fitness club in the Gold Coast neighborhood, through means that were technically legal but deeply invasive, because Jiho operated on the principle that information was just a resource like any other. He was there at 7 a.m. on Thursday, positioned near the smoothie bar with a particular brand of calculated casualness he had perfected over years of being precisely this kind of man. She came in at 7:15 wearing a burnt orange sports set, locks pulled back, headphones around her neck. She was on her phone, talking rapidly about quarterly projections, and she walked past him without seeing him. Jiho waited. 20 minutes into her treadmill run, she came to the smoothie bar. He made his move with the fluid confidence of a man who had never once in his life been told no by a woman he wanted. Mango or berry? He asked, gesturing toward the menu. I can never decide. She glanced at him with the polite detachment people use on strangers. Mango. The berry is too sweet. You sound certain. I am certain, she said. Then she ordered her smoothie and for a moment he thought she would leave. But her phone rang, she muttered something frustrated under her breath, and she turned slightly away to take the call. In turning, she almost knocked her smoothie off the counter. Jiho caught it. She turned back, phone still at her ear, and looked at him with a flash of surprised appreciation. He smiled, and Jiho's smile was genuinely dangerous. Not in the way Ye-Jin was dangerous, which was deep and still and architectural like a locked room that made you wonder what was inside. Jiho's smile was dangerous the way a lit match near silk is dangerous. Immediate, dazzling, and potentially destructive. She said something brief into her phone and hung up. "Thank you," she said, taking the smoothie. "Jiho," he said, extending his hand. "Karen." She shook it. "Korean? That obvious?" "I've been meeting Koreans in Chicago recently," she said, and something passed over her eyes that he couldn't read. "It's the accent. And the bone structure," she added, then seemed to catch herself as if she hadn't meant to say the second part aloud. Jiho noted this with internal delight. "You have good bone structure yourself," he said. "Actually remarkable." "That's a strange compliment." "Strange or honest?" She laughed and he watched it transform her face. He was already constructing the narrative in his head, the gym meeting, the smoothies, the accidental connection. It was a good story. The kind he told well. "Are you in Chicago long?" she asked. "Long enough," he said. "Maybe longer if the city keeps surprising me." She read this correctly for what it was, a line, and her eyes did something complicated, acknowledging the line while simultaneously refusing to be flattened by it. "You like that?" He liked it more than he expected to. They talked for 11 minutes. She had a meeting at 9. When she left, she didn't give him her number but she said, "I'm here most Thursdays and Fridays." Jiho considered that an invitation. He did not think once about his brother, who had spent the previous Thursday on a rooftop with this exact woman, talking about their mothers until midnight. In the weeks that followed, Karen Whitfield found herself in the unusual position of being sincerely interested in two different men she'd met within days of each other, for entirely different reasons. Ye-Jin called her 3 days after their rooftop conversation. He had tracked down her professional contact through her company's public listings. She noticed this, appreciated the legitimacy of it, and sent a formal message through her office first, asking if she was comfortable with him having her personal number. The formality of it charmed her in ways she wasn't immediately ready to admit. When she said yes, he called that evening and they talked for 2 hours about architecture, about the burden of inheriting a father's legacy, about Chicago winters and Korean summers, about what it meant to build something that outlasted you. He never once pushed. He never once performed. He asked questions and then he actually listened to the answers, with the focused patience of a man who understood that listening was its own form of power. Jiho, by contrast, swept. That was the only word for it. He sent flowers on the second day, not a cliché arrangement but a single rare Ecuadorian rose in a narrow vase with a note that said, "Not because it's romantic. Because I noticed you're not the kind of woman who needs a dozen of something to know it's significant." He took her to dinner at a restaurant that wasn't yet open to the public. A friend of his was the chef, and the exclusivity of it was intoxicating even as the more self-aware part of Karen recognized it was designed to be. He made her feel like the most seen person in any room, which was impressive because Karen Whitfield already felt fairly seen. She told her best friend Tasha about both of them one afternoon over wine in her penthouse apartment. "Okay," Tasha said, holding up both hands. "There's the serious one and the fun one." "I hate that I know exactly what you mean," Karen said. "The serious one sounds like he'd be there during a crisis." "He would. He absolutely would." "And the fun one?" Karen twirled her glass. "The fun one makes me feel like I'm already in a movie. Everything with him has this quality of being electric and perfectly lit." "Perfectly lit things are usually staged," Tasha observed. "I know," Karen said. She was quiet for a moment. "But Ye-Jin," she stopped, and the way she said his name was different. Softer around the edges, more careful, like something she was trying not to break. "Ye-Jin said something to me last week. I mentioned that the hardest part of running my father's company is that sometimes I don't know where his dream ends and mine begins." And he went completely quiet for a long time and then he said, "The moment you can no longer hear the difference between your voice and his, that is when you build something new. Not instead of his dream but above it. The way a second floor doesn't erase the first." Tasha stared at her. "He said that. He said that. Karen." "I know. That man is in love with you and he hasn't even kissed you yet, has he?" Karen looked out the window at the Chicago skyline. "No," she said quietly. "He hasn't. What's he waiting for?" "I think," Karen said slowly. He's waiting until it means something permanent. The kiss happened on a Thursday night rooftop, 3 weeks after they'd first spoken. They had spent the evening there again, their third time, and by now the bartender simply saw them and started their orders. Ye-Jin had been in Korea for 10 days prior and returned to Chicago solely, transparently, unashamedly solely, to see her, and she knew it, and the knowledge of it sat in her chest like something warm and heavy. They had been talking about his family, which he spoke of sparingly. His parents. His father's insistence on legacy. He didn't mention a brother and she didn't ask, and later she would understand why that omission felt, in retrospect, like the opening note of a song she wasn't ready to hear. They were standing at the rooftop railing, looking at the city, and he had been quiet for a while in the way he was sometimes quiet, not uncomfortable but charged like a held breath. She turned to look at him and found him already looking at her, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a human being. Ye-Jin Kong, who ran an empire with a face like carved stone, was looking at her like she was the solution to a problem he hadn't known how to name. "Karen," he said. "Yes," she said, not answering a question, just acknowledging that she was there, that she was listening, that whatever he was about to say had her full attention. He reached up and tucked one of her loose locks behind her ear, his fingers barely grazing her jaw, and the gentleness of it, from a man she knew instinctively was not often gentle, made her breath catch. Then he leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to redirect, and kissed her. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was not the kind of kiss that Jiho would have orchestrated, with perfect lighting and cinematic timing. It was quiet and deliberate, and so entirely focused on her that Karen felt something behind her sternum physically loosen, something she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. Outside, Chicago hummed and blazed. She closed her eyes. "I should tell you something," he said softly. "Tell me later," she said, and kissed him again. He would of course tell her later. But later came sooner than either of them expected. The collision happened on a Saturday afternoon, 3.5 weeks after Ye-Jin and Karen's first rooftop conversation, approximately 2 weeks after Jiho had begun his own careful campaign for her attention. Karen had agreed to meet Jiho for a walk along the Riverwalk followed by lunch. She had, simultaneously, invited Ye-Jin to meet her that same afternoon at a gallery opening she was patronizing. The timings didn't overlap or weren't supposed to. But Jiho arrived early and Ye-Jin ran late, and at approximately 2:14 on a Saturday afternoon, Karen Whitfield was standing outside the Riverwalk Cafe where she'd had lunch with Jiho, telling him she needed to be somewhere at 3, when Ye-Jin turned the corner. The three of them stood in a triangle on the sidewalk, and the universe, which has a flair for dramatic timing that rivals any novelist, gave them all exactly 4 seconds of absolute stillness. It was Ye-Jin who moved first. He looked at Jiho. Jiho looked at Ye-Jin. Something passed between them, a lightning bolt of recognition wrapped in a nuclear explosion of comprehension, and the color drained from both their faces. "Hyung," Jiho said, barely audible. The Korean word for older brother. Ye-Jin's jaw tightened with the controlled precision of a man who was very, very good at not showing what he was feeling in public. "Jiho." Karen looked between them. Back and forth. The height was similar. The jawline was similar. The cheekbones were unmistakably similar. The silence between them was the silence of two people who shared a language she had not been given the dictionary for. "You know each other," she said. It wasn't a question by the time she finished saying it. "He is my brother," Ye-Jin said, looking at her now, and the expression in his eyes was something she had no name for, not anger, not guilt, but something that encompassed both and went deeper than either. Karen Whitfield was not a woman who fell apart in public. She had stood outside courthouses, weathered boardroom ambushes, buried her father without crying until she was home and alone. But the blood left her face in a single smooth wave, and she said very quietly, "Excuse me," and walked to the railing of the Riverwalk and stood with her back to both of them. Behind her, the brothers looked at each other. "You knew," Jiho said low. "I knew nothing." "When did you meet her?" 3 weeks ago." Ye-Jin said nothing for a moment. "I met her 4 weeks ago." Jiho closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something complicated was happening there, the first real reckoning Jiho had done in a while with the difference between wanting something and deserving it. "How serious?" "Don't," Ye-Jin said. The single word was not loud. It didn't need to be. Karen turned back to them. Her expression had resettled into something calm and very, very dangerous. "I want both of you to hear this clearly," she said. "I'm not a prize. I'm not a conquest. I am not a coincidence that the two of you get to process at my expense." She picked up her bag from the ground where she'd set it. I need time to think. Neither of you should contact me for the next 3 days. She left without looking back. Ye-Jin watched her go. Then he turned to his brother, and the silence between them was the silence of two men who loved each other and had just walked into something that could destroy both things at once. She took 4 days, not 3, because Karen Whitfield operated on her own timetable. On the first day she was furious, at the situation, at herself, at the absurdity of the universe's sense of humor. On the second day she assembled her feelings in rows and examined them with the same precision she applied to hostile acquisition bids. On the third day Tasha came over and they drank tea, and Karen said some things out loud that she hadn't been able to admit silently. When I found out they were brothers, she said, staring at the ceiling, my first thought wasn't, oh no, I've been seeing 2 men at the same time. She paused. My first thought was, which one? Tasha said nothing. I knew immediately, Karen said. Before I'd even had time to think about it, I knew. That terrifies me a little. Because you chose Ye-Jin, Tasha said. I chose Ye-Jin, Karen confirmed. Without even deciding to. On the 4th day Ye-Jin's message arrived. Not from his number. Through her office, formal again the way it had been the very first time. An envelope, delivered by courier, containing a handwritten letter on heavy cream paper. She read it at her desk, and her assistant wisely found reasons to be elsewhere. The letter said in part, I will not argue for myself against my brother. I will not reduce what we have begun into a competition, because you deserve better than to be competed for. What I will say is this. You told me on our second night that you date men who lead with honesty and follow through. I have been honest with you from the first word I spoke to you. As for follow through, I am here. I will be here. Whatever you decide, I want you to decide it fully, freely, and without the weight of my wanting pressing on you. But if you want to know what I want to know you for the rest of my life. I want to hear you say, I'm being accurate, there's a difference for 40 more years. I want to be the person who is there when you figure out where your dream ends and your father's begins. Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere. Ye-Jin. Karen read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her desk drawer. She called him that evening. I need to talk to Jiho first, she said. I know, he said immediately. And then I need to talk to you. Whenever you're ready. She met Jiho at a quiet coffee shop in Lincoln Park 2 days later. He arrived looking like he hadn't slept well, which was unusual enough on its face to be significant. Jiho, she had learned, always looked perfect. The slight shadow under his eyes, the lack of practice sparkle, she recognized it for what it was. Not heartbreak exactly. More like a man meeting his own depth for the first time and finding it disorienting. I want to be honest with you, she said before he could speak. You're extraordinary, Jiho. You're charming and magnetic and you made me feel electric, which is not nothing. I want you to know I see you. The real parts. She paused. But I think the real parts are still finding their way out. And I think you know that too. He looked at his coffee cup for a long moment. Then he smiled, and for once it wasn't the dangerous smile. It was something quieter, more real, and she thought, there it is. That's who he is when he stops performing. He loves you, Jiho said. He has never, in 32 years, I have never seen my brother write a letter by hand. He looked up at her. Not once. Not for anything. I know, Karen said softly. Take care of him, Jiho said. Then after a beat, he'll give you his whole heart. Don't waste it. The Kang family intervention came before Karen had even given her answer. It arrived in the form of a phone call from Seoul, from Kang Soo-hyun, matriarch, architect, and a woman who had built her sons with the same deliberate care she'd applied to every building she'd ever designed. She had heard, through the intricate relay of family intelligence, that both her sons had become entangled with the same woman in America, and she had opinions. Ye-Jin took the call in his hotel suite, standing at the floor-to-ceiling window watching the city. His mother's voice was composed but carried underneath it the particular frequency that told him this was not a casual conversation. Tell me about her, his mother said after the preliminary architecture of Korean family pleasantries had been constructed and disposed of. She is Robert Whitfield's daughter. She runs the company now. She is, he stopped. How did you summarize Karen to someone who had never seen her laugh, never heard her say I'm being accurate, there's a difference, never watched her choose sparkling water over a martini because she was working, never felt the particular quality of her attention when she decided you were worth it? She is the most honest person I have met, he said finally. She doesn't say things she doesn't mean and she doesn't mean things she doesn't say. His mother was quiet for a moment. And Jiho? Jiho met her separately. He didn't know she was? He stopped again. Neither of us knew. Does she know what you are, Ye-Jin? His mother's voice was careful. What you are. They both knew what that meant. The businesses in the light and the one in the dark. Not everything, he said. Not yet. She will need to know. I know. Does she choose you? I don't know yet. I haven't. Ye-Jin. His mother's voice shifted slightly. You wrote her a letter. He said nothing, which was its own answer. Your father wrote me a letter, she said quietly. Before he proposed. He had terrible handwriting and he knew it, so he wrote it 7 times. I still have all 7 drafts. Pause. Go get your girl. And then bring her to Seoul so I can meet her. His father's voice came on the line next. Unexpected, brief, characteristic. Kang Dae-ho, patriarch and empire builder. Your brother will be fine, he said. He needs time to grow into himself. Let him have that. Focus on your own life. A pause that felt like a whole speech. She sounds like a woman worth keeping. Keep her properly. The line went quiet. Ye-Jin stood at the window for a long time after. 2,000 miles away, Jiho was having his own version of this conversation. His mother's voice was softer with him than with Ye-Jin, which was the way it had always been. She knew Jiho needed gentler architecture. Love makes us better, Jihoya, she said. But only when we choose people who can see who we're trying to become, not just who we are now. Jiho was quiet. She chose your brother, his mother said gently. She hasn't said so. She will. After the call, Jiho sat with himself for a long time. He thought about the moment outside the river walk, when he'd looked at his brother's face and seen something he recognized but had never seen in that particular concentration before. Certainty. The kind that doesn't make noise, doesn't need an audience. Jiho had always chased things loudly. He was beginning to understand that some things were only found in the quiet. He called Ye-Jin that night. Don't lose her, he said when his brother picked up. I'm telling you, don't lose her. Jiho. I mean it, Hyung. I was chasing something in her, I don't know entirely what. But you were finding something. That's different. His voice was more serious than Ye-Jin had heard it in years. Go find it properly. Karen called Ye-Jin on a Sunday evening at the exact time of night they'd first started talking, just after 9. He picked up before the second ring. I need you to take me somewhere, she said. Not a restaurant. Not somewhere impressive. Somewhere real. Somewhere that actually means something to you. 2 hours later, they were standing in the lobby of a building in the West Loop that was undergoing renovation. A building that Ye-Jin's Chicago-based firm had quietly purchased 3 months prior with plans to restore it to its original 1924 grandeur. He had the keys. He led her through the skeletal interior with a flashlight, explaining what each space would become, his voice doing that thing she had noticed early, the way it changed when he talked about something he genuinely loved. Quieter, more precise, each word chosen rather than placed. They stood in what would become the building's central atrium, looking up through the uncompleted upper floors at a square of night sky. The flashlight pooled on the concrete between them. I have to tell you something, Ye-Jin said. I know, she said. My business in Korea. He stopped, and in the stop she heard the weight of what was coming. There are parts of it that are not entirely in the light. I'm not a simple businessman, Karen. I have never been. He looked at her steadily. I won't tell you everything tonight. Some of it is not mine to tell in a single conversation. But I want you to know that it exists. I want you to decide with complete information. She studied him for a long time. Are you telling me you're dangerous? I am telling you I am complicated. Are you telling me the people you love are protected? Absolutely. Without question. Always. Are you telling me that if I'm with you I'm safe? I am telling you, he said, that if you are with me, there is nothing in this world or any other that will reach you. Ever. She looked up at the square of night sky. Then she looked back at him. I know who you are, Ye-Jin. I've been watching you for weeks. Not the empire, not the business, you. The way you hold your glass. The way you went quiet for 30 seconds before answering a question about your mother. The way you sent a message through my office first because you wanted to make sure I was comfortable. She paused. Complicated doesn't frighten me. I grew up with complicated. He exhaled, a long, slow exhale that sounded like the releasing of something carried for years. There's something else, she said. I chose you. I want you to know that. Not because Jiho wasn't remarkable, because he was. But I chose you before I knew you were brothers. I chose you the second week. Maybe the first. I just needed the drama of the situation to clarify it. The flashlight between them cast everything in gold. Ye-Jin Kang crossed the distance between them in 3 steps, took her face in both hands with extraordinary care, and kissed her in the way that meant everything he hadn't yet found English words for. He proposed 6 months later in Seoul. Karen had come to meet his parents, a trip that had been preceded by approximately 47 anxious text messages from Jiho, who had appointed himself an unofficial cultural liaison and was deeply invested in making sure his brother didn't somehow manage to ruin this. Wear something classic, Jiho had told Karen over the phone. My mother respects structure. Also, she will test you. Intellectually. Do not be intimidated. Pause. Actually, don't take my advice. You'll be fine. You're terrifying in the best way. Kang Soo-hyun met Karen at the door of the family compound in Gangnam, and the two women looked at each other with the particular assessment of people who recognize each other's kind immediately. Then the older woman smiled, a rare architectural smile that Ye-Jin recognized as the highest form of approval she dispensed, and said in excellent English, I drew the elevation for this house in 1988. I will show you the original plans. Karen looked at Ye-Jin. Ye-Jin looked at the ceiling briefly, overwhelmed by gratitude. The proposal itself was private. No rooftop, no audience, no restaurant. Ye-Jin took her to the mountain behind his childhood home at dusk, a trail he'd walked 10,000 times growing up, and at the top, where Seoul spread itself out below them like a circuit board of light, he turned to her without ceremony. I have thought, he said, about how to do this properly. I consulted no one because this is between us. I bought nothing extravagant because that is not what we are. He reached into his jacket and produced a ring, a deep blue sapphire set in brushed gold, simple and entirely extraordinary. My mother's architect's ring, he said. She asked me to give it to you. She said a woman who understands buildings deserves a ring with structure. Karen's hand pressed flat against her sternum. I need you to know, he continued, that I have never in my life wanted something the way I want this. Not an acquisition, not a deal, not a position. Your mornings. Your arguments. Your notebooks. Your sparkling water when you're working. Your laugh. His voice, usually so controlled, fractured almost imperceptibly at the edges. Your laugh, Karen. I need your laugh in my life until there is no more life for it to be in. Ye-Jin, she said, and her voice was doing something she almost never allowed it to do. I know who I am, he said. I know the complicated parts. I am asking you to choose all of it, not in spite of the complexity but because I will spend every day being worth the choosing. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She looked at Seoul spread out below them like every story the city had ever held, all of it lit up and waiting. Yes, she said. Obviously yes. Yes. He slid the ring onto her finger and stood up and held her, and Seoul turned on its axis around them, indifferent and brilliant and perfect. The wedding was held in Chicago because Karen said it should be where they met. Ye-Jin agreed without negotiation, which Jiho later said was the most obvious proof of love he had ever witnessed. His brother, who negotiated the terms of everything, accepting terms for nothing. The venue was the restored building in the West Loop, finished at last, its 1924 grandeur intact and amplified. The atrium where they had stood with a flashlight looking at a square of night sky had been transformed into something that looked like a dream a building might have. High ceilings, warm stone, ivy trained along the upper balustrades, candles and hundreds of amber vessels turning everything the color of late afternoon. Tasha was the maid of honor. Jiho was the best man. At the rehearsal dinner, Jiho gave a toast that made Karen cry and made Ye-Jin look at his brother with an expression that reset, visibly, something between them. I am responsible for nothing good that happened between these two people, Jiho said, and I want to make that clear for the historical record. But I was there for the collision. And I want you both to know that from the outside, from the angle of a man who was trying to win what Ye-Jin had already begun to earn, from that angle what I saw was the most beautiful example of two people who were simply, profoundly correct for each other. He raised his glass. To my brother who taught me that love is not a competition. And to Karen who taught me by choosing him, what it looks like to know exactly what you deserve. The room was quiet for a moment. Then applause. Ye-Jin's mother leaned across the table to Karen and said quietly in Korean, which Karen had been learning for 2 months, something Jiho had quietly arranged to help her with, he has never let anyone see that side of him before. You've done that. Don't underestimate what it means. Karen had reached across and taken the older woman's hand. The wedding day began with Karen in a suite at the Langham, the same hotel where everything had started, which had been Ye-Jin's quiet, deliberate choice, sitting at a vanity while Tasha fussed with her veil and the room smelled of gardenias and someone had put on a playlist that kept making everyone cry at inconvenient moments. Her dress was ivory silk with a long train and structural bodice that Soo-hyun had had a hand in designing, because the woman was an architect who had opinions about structure in all forms, and Karen had asked her to be involved, and it had become one of the most important conversations of the year. The sapphire ring on her left hand caught the light and threw blue sparks across the ceiling. "You nervous?" Tasha asked. "No," Karen said, which was true. She was many things, moved, overwhelmed, aware of the magnitude of what was about to happen, but nervous was not among them. Nervous implied uncertainty. She was not uncertain. She had not been uncertain since a Sunday evening 6 months ago when she'd called a man and asked him to take her somewhere real. "He's already there," Tasha reported, reading her phone. "Jiho says he's been there for an hour. Jiho also says Ye-Jin won't stop rearranging the flowers, which is the most on-brand thing I have ever heard about that man." Karen laughed, and the laugh was the old one, the full, uninhibited, real one. "That's the one," Tasha said softly. "That's the one he's going to hear for 40 years. When Karen walked into the atrium on the arm of Whitfield Industries' longtime CFO, a surrogate father figure who had known her since she was 8, the room stood as rooms do. But the room could have been empty. Karen's eyes went directly to the front, directly to Ye-Jin, and the 160 people between them ceased to exist as a relevant factor. He was standing at the altar in a black suit that was flawless in the way that things are flawless when they've been chosen rather than assembled, and he was watching her come toward him with an expression that Karen would later say she didn't have adequate language for. It was the expression of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and could finally, at last, put it down. Not because he was surrendering but because he had found somewhere safe to set it. Jiho stood beside him, and when he saw Karen's face, he pressed his lips together and looked briefly at the ceiling. She reached the altar. The CFO placed her hand in Ye-Jin's, which was warm and steady, and stepped back. "You rearranged the flowers," Karen said quietly before the officiant could begin. "3 times, he admitted. She squeezed his hand. The vows were theirs, written separately, shared for the first time here in front of everyone. Ye-Jin's were precise and careful, each sentence weighed and chosen, and they contained the line, "I promise to listen to you the way I listened that first night, not waiting for you to finish, but trying to understand every syllable because every syllable matters." Karen's were longer and warmer and contained the line, "I promise to be honest with you even when honesty is complicated and expensive. Especially then." When he kissed her, the room broke into the kind of applause that happens when an audience has been holding their breath. Jiho clapped loudest. At the reception, late in the evening, after the first dance and the toasts and the cutting of a wedding cake that Soo-hyun had quietly supervised the baker in making, Karen found Jiho at the edge of the atrium, leaning against a pillar with a glass of champagne, watching the room. She stood beside him. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For what you said at the rehearsal dinner. For telling him not to lose me, when you had every reason to be difficult." She paused. "And for the Korean lessons." He looked at her sideways. "He doesn't know about those." "I know he doesn't know about those. I'm going to tell him someday." She bumped his shoulder with hers. "You're going to be okay, Jiho." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know. I actually know that now." He looked across the room to where Ye-Jin was talking to his parents, and their father had one hand on Ye-Jin's shoulder, and his mother was smiling the architectural smile. "He was always better at being still than I was," Jiho said. "I used to think that was a limitation. Being still. Being quiet. Waiting." He shook his head slightly. "I understand now that it was him knowing what he was waiting for." Karen followed his gaze. Across the room, as if sensing it, Ye-Jin looked up and found her. The look between them, even across a full and noisy room, was the look of people who have located in each other something foundational, something that doesn't require maintenance or performance, that simply is, the way walls simply are, the way a first floor simply is beneath everything built above it. He crossed the room. He took her hand. "Dance with me," he said. "We already had our first dance. I want another one." "You want whatever you want, don't you?" she said, but she was already moving with him toward the floor. "Only you," he said. "Only ever you." Jiho watched them go. Then he straightened up from the pillar, adjusted his jacket, and went to find someone interesting to talk to, because Jiho Kang was, at his core, a man who needed people, and he was slowly, carefully learning to need them in ways that were honest and sustainable and real. The atrium was warm with candles and champagne and the particular electricity of a room full of people witnessing something that mattered. The 1924 building held them all gently, its restored bones doing what good structures do, not calling attention to themselves, simply creating the conditions for everything inside to thrive. Outside, Chicago pressed its skyline against the winter night, indifferent and magnificent. Inside, Ye-Jin Kong held his wife on the dance floor, because she was his wife now, and that word sat in his chest like something he would spend the rest of his life learning the full weight of, and he thought about a rooftop and a laugh, and a woman who ordered a martini and chose sparkling water because she was working. He thought about 40 years of that laugh. He thought about second floors above first floors. He thought about how strange and precise and absolute it was, the architecture of love, the way it declared itself in load-bearing structures long before you had the language to name what you were building. He held her tighter. She said something into his shoulder, too quiet for the room to hear. He bent his head to her. Say that again? She lifted her face, and her eyes were warm and sure and exactly what he had always needed. I said, I'm being accurate, there's a difference. He laughed, quiet, real, the kind that came from somewhere below performance, and kissed the top of her head. And the building held them, and the city burned outside with all its 1,000 ordinary lights, and somewhere across the room Jiho raised his glass at no one in particular, and the night went on, carrying all of them inside it, moving forward the way that every good story does, not toward an ending but deeper into what it means to have finally, after everything, arrived. Thank you for watching. We appreciate your support for this channel. See you in the next story.